Allan Katz is a former city commissioner of the city of Tallahassee, Florida, former insurance commissioner, former ambassador to Portugal appointed by President Obama, and he is currently the founder of American Public Square and a distinguished professor at the Block School of Management and the UMKC School of Law. I can think of no one more qualified to speak with us this morning about civility and public dialogue than Allan Katz. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paula. Can you all hear me in the back? Only because I don't hear very well and sometimes I talk too softly, so if I move this microphone where you cannot hear me, just raise your hand or yell at me or something like that, and I'll try to get better. First of all, it's really a pleasure to be here. League of Women Voters bring back a lot of memories for me. My mother, I grew up in St. Louis, and until the 5th grade we lived in Rock Hill, which is adjacent to Webster Groves, for those of you that know a little about St. Louis. And my mother was the president of the League of Women Voters of Rock Hill. And, you know, back in the 50s, there were not a whole lot of opportunities for women to be involved in politics. And the League of Women Voters attracted people like my mother. And I remember my mother, why I remember that is this is beyond my comprehension because I was very young at the time, but I remember my mother discussing with a friend of hers when I was in earshot about the possibility of resigning her presidency because she felt so strongly that she needed to go out and work for Adlai Stevenson in 1956. So that is my first recollection of the League. And of course, what happens is that, you know, the role of all institutions in our society, they arise at times, usually because they're needed, and then in some ways they get eclipsed because other opportunities come along. I'm always fond of pointing out to my children that one of the reasons that public education, in my opinion, is not as good as it once was, is because when I was young, there were very few opportunities for women. Women who went to college were in the minority, and they were almost all very smart. And there basically were two career paths. You could be a teacher, you could be a nurse. And so we had really great teachers, with these really smart women who were very demanding on us, and therefore a lot of us who went to public schools in those days had really wonderful educations. Now what's happened, of course, is that today there are women attorneys and women, you know, Supreme Court justices and in every other walk of life, and while opportunity is still nowhere near as great for women as it is for men, the world has changed rather significantly. And so what happens is that the important question really for organizations is whether we can retain our relevance as things change. And I think that clearly the League can do that and has done that, particularly at a time where we see an inordinate effort in a variety of places, which seems to be geared towards voter suppression and keeping people from voting. But I think that the idea of the League and then the active involvement that you have in voter registration drives and just sort of continuing to underscore the significance in the community of people voting is very important. In fact, I teach a course at UMKC which is called Civic Participation. And so the first day of class I announce to the students, I say, there's one way to fail the course. If you're not registered to vote by the end of the semester, and if you've not provided us with documented evidence that you are, you fail the course. And someone said, well, they said, can you do that? I said, I just did. And I said, there are only two exceptions, that if you are someone who is not an American citizen, then you can provide us with a copy of your visa, and that's fine. Or if you're a convicted felon, and then you should come see me. And otherwise, you know, we expect that all of you will be registered to vote. And so, and I don't think that this is, to me, this is sort of, again, part of the basic notion of civic participation. Now, it may speak to the way I was raised and how I grew up. I mean, I grew up in a family where my father was a survivor from the Holocaust. My parents thought that, America offered such a unique opportunity. I do often point out, now that I'm back in Missouri, that my parents never voted for Harry Truman. They didn't live in Missouri when he ran for the Senate. And then in 1948, when they did live in Missouri, they voted for Henry Wallace. So, which explains in some way sort of the background that I grew up with. But what I really want to talk about today is I want to talk about what American Public Square is and why we exist. So in order to tell you, first of all, let me tell you what we are. We are a group, for those of you that don't know, I describe us as unlike-minded people who are prepared and continue to engage in community forums about very controversial issues. But we do it that are fact-based and are civil. Now, one would think that you don't need a special organization to have that, but unfortunately, we know that's not true. So that's what we are, and how we got and why we are. Let me go back a little in time. There's a wonderful book which some of you, I'm sure, have read called The Big Sort by Bill Bishop, and they write that in 1976, when Jimmy Carter was elected president, approximately 25% of Americans lived in counties that were referred to as so-called landslide counties. That means that for one party or the other, one party won the county by 20% or more. So an overwhelming number of the people were like-minded in terms of their politics. By 2004, over half of Americans lived in landslide counties. So if you think about what that means that means when you went down every block in your neighborhood, and if there were yard signs out, they were all for the same candidate. And when you went to church or synagogue or mosque, or wherever everyone kind of agreed with you. And when you think now about your friends and the people that you interact with on a daily basis, most of us, if we're honest about it, recognize that, we all kind of think the same way about most things. And the danger, of course, with that is that we think after a while that our opinions are facts. And then if we're liberal, we turn on MSNBC at night, and we're sitting there going, yeah, I know that. Or if we're conservative, we turn on Fox News, and we do the same sort of thing. In fact, if you turn on Fox News, and I sort of think everyone should do this, you should turn on Fox News one night, and then turn on MSNBC, and you will think you live in alternate universes. You can't believe that they are reporting on the same events in the same country. Okay? Because what's happened is that when a lot of us grew up, we had what was a commonwealth of facts. It's called the evening news. Okay? And we didn't necessarily agree with everything or like everything. And then the argument would be, what did it mean? Should the Pentagon Papers have been released or not? Was this a violation of national security? Who thought this was right or that was right? But those days are gone. And they're gone for a whole bunch of different reasons. And they're not gone, in my opinion, because there's some massive conspiracy to take over the United States from the left or the right. They're gone because what's happened is that the world has changed. The world's changed in terms of where we get our information, how we get our information. We have more information available to us in an instant than our parents had in a lifetime. And so as a result, what happens is that it becomes, in my opinion, incumbent upon people in the community to sort of say, okay, we're going to sort through all of this. We're going to sort of be willing to make sure that there is a factual basis for the things that we're talking about. But that means we have to tolerate people with whom we disagree. And more importantly, what we have to do is we have to recognize that just because someone disagrees with you doesn't make them a bad person. So if someone believes the Affordable Care Act is a bad thing, and that passing that bill was bad for the country because of their belief about the role of government, it doesn't mean they hate poor people. Now, they may, but the point is that it doesn't mean that they do. It's like if people have tremendous problems with the Patriot Act because they think it's too much of an invasion of privacy, it doesn't mean that they think terrorists are okay. And the problem is we have created all these industries really throughout our country that make their living by continuing to be megaphones on a very, very divisive approach to all of these issues that we have. Let me tell you how we began American Public Square and why all this, I think, fits together. I hope it does. First of all, it didn't begin as American Public Square. In 2006, I was the city commissioner in Tallahassee, Florida. And while I went to UMKC as an undergraduate, I didn't think that I was ever going to be returning to Kansas City, and certainly didn't expect myself to be standing up here today. But the city of Tallahassee owned a utility. And it was an all-gas utility. And there was an argument that as the price of gas went up, which it did particularly after the hurricane, that what we should do is diversify our fuel mix. And 2 counties away, there were a number of utilities that decided they were going to build a coal plant. Now they kept saying, oh, it's going to be a clean coal plant, which some people might argue is an oxymoron. But nonetheless, the fact is that, and there was potentially an economic argument that said, if the cost of electricity in our community would be kept down for people who couldn't afford their electricity, that's an economic argument for this. And so, as a city commissioner, there were only 5 of us. We were brought this plan by the utility, and I sat there dumb, fat, and happy like everyone else, going, okay, well, I guess it makes sense they're going to build the thing anyway, and we probably ought to go ahead and take 150 megawatts of it, and it'll be good for diversifying our fuel mix, and sort of went on. And then we went and had a public hearing. You all have been to many public hearings. It's generally what public hearings are is a way to let everyone come and scream and shout, and then people who vote go back and do what they were going to do anyway, which is kind of what I thought was going to happen. And 2 mothers from that county got up there, and what they said was, why would you think that your children's health is more important to you than our children's health is to us? And I looked at them, and I realized I had no answer for them, that they were right. And at that moment, I switched. I was the only member to switch, and it was a 2-year fight, and ultimately we killed the coal plant. But along the way, there was a huge amount of misinformation flying on all sides. There was no, what I would call, legitimate conversation, because there are pros and cons. I mean, there are, in other words, very few things are absolute in terms of having no value or are always right when you do them. But we weren't having that conversation. So someone came to me and they said, why don't we create this an organization where we can sort of do something like this in the community? And I said, sure. I said, here's the deal. I was running for re-election. I said, I'll take all my extra campaign money and we'll fund it with that, but you have to run it. And I said, I'll recruit the board, and I'll go find a Republican friend of mine to be the co-chair, since I'm a Democrat. And so she did, and I did, and we did, and it's still going today. And what happened really was the first year we decided to have, the topic was going to be on energy and the future of the energy in the community. Well, it's not the sexiest topic in the world. And so, we decided to have it was going to be a dinner, and we were charging $25 for the dinner. You came to the dinner, and we had some people up there, and they were going to have a conversation, and there was going to be questions and answers from the floor. And so I went to the room. Now, Tallahassee, Florida is a community today of about 250,000 people. At the time, there were probably a couple 100,000 folks. I'd lived there 25 years. I was a city commissioner. You go to things like that, you know who's going to show up. You think. And I walked in the room, and I looked around, and I went up to the woman who was organizing it, and I said, who are these people? And that was when I got the first notion that there was this tremendous hunger in the community to have some other kind of conversation than the ones that we're exposed to all the time. And that when you begin to be part of that, what you have to give up is the really good feeling that when you get really mad at somebody politically, that you can just rail against them all the time, and everyone that supports them, and everyone supports them must be this, that, or the other, because otherwise, how could they not see things the way you see things? You kind of have to put that to the side. I mean, occasionally you can do it at home, you know. But generally speaking, you do, because that doesn't get you anywhere. What you do, where it gets you is where we are today. I'm sorry, it doesn't get you somewhere. It gets you exactly where we are today. And the problem is this. If you don't like Donald Trump, and if you're a Democrat, it doesn't matter. If you don't like Nancy Pelosi, and you're a Republican, it doesn't matter. Because the moment that criticism comes flying from one side or the other, it's immediately dismissed because of where it comes from. And so what happens really is that it seemed to me that what we really needed to try to do is to have a different conversation where people were willing to be critical of people with whom they agreed on a lot of issues. In other words, it's okay to say, I disagree with Claire McCaskill even though I'm a Democrat on X, Y, or Z, or I disagree with Kevin Yoder even though I'm a Republican on issue X, Y, or Z. And that doesn't mean that I'm going to say to them, we're going to throw you out of office because you don't agree with me on everything. And the problem, though, is that that's what we have kind of evolved to in a larger sense. So what American Public Square tries to do is we try to create an environment that says, you know, come on to our programs. We're a membership organization just like you all are. But come to the program. We had a program Thursday night. We had, it was on the Affordable Care Act. We had 560 people register. The weather probably kept 80 or 90 of them away. We generally think there's usually an attrition rate. I think you all know what I'm talking about if you're part of organizations. But it was a very large crowd. And we had 4 people talking about the Affordable Care Act, one from the American Enterprise Institute, which is, many of you know, is a conservative think tank, one from Kaiser, one from one former reporter, and we had the 4th one who's, and I'm blanking right now. But the point was they didn't agree with each other on different aspects of the Affordable Care Act and what needed to be done to change it. But it was a very civil conversation. They disagreed with each other. They pointed out where they thought things where the other person was wrong. And this is how we do these programs. First of all, we have real-time fact checkers. That's always kind of fun, you know? I mean, so one panelist once asked me, who checks the fact checkers? And what I said to him was, no one. I mean, because these are our fact checkers, our research librarians, as I say, with no known political affiliation. And what we do is, so if I'm sitting up there and I'm doing, for example, one of our early programs, we also have what we call civility bells, where we hand it out, and basically if things get uncivil, someone hits the bell and everything stops, and we sort of start over again. If the fact checker, I mean, in the audience, people get little pieces of paper. On one side's a question, and one side's a fact check. If I'm sitting up here and I say, you know, immigration's increased 30% this year, and you think, that doesn't sound right, and you write it down, you hold it up, the volunteer takes it over to the research librarian checks it on the database, they signal the moderator stops the program, and says, our fact checker's got something here. And this is not to embarrass anyone, this is just to make sure. And so they say what it is, and you give the individual a chance to walk it back, and then you go forward. You would be astonished at how few fact checks we actually need to do. People are so much more careful when they know they're actually. I mean, we had a program, I'm trying to remember which one it was, where one of the panelists said, well, I know you have fact checkers, so I think this is the right number. Would they please check it for me? You know? Now, how many times have you ever heard anyone in any kind of a discussion of a topic like that make those kinds of hesitations? So we think it actually works, and we think it actually makes for a much better conversation. We tell people we don't want them to applaud because, you know, red meat lines thrown out getting applause have a tendency not to make it a better conversation, but a worse conversation. I always tell people, if you agree with what you just heard, you should do this. If you disagree, you should do that. But please be quiet, because we're trying to have a conversation. Audience questions make up approximately half of the program. We have what we call our roving reporter. We use Nick Haynes sometimes. We use different people in KCUR. And they collect the questions. And that means what we don't have is what all of you have seen from time to time, where somebody they have a quote question, but really they want to give a speech. And so we don't have any of that. So really what happens is that we move, and we've had programs. One of the programs I always like to cite, because it was one of our better ones, I thought, was we did one on immigration. And so we had the National Vice President La Raza there. We had 2 economists. And then we had the always non-controversial Chris Kobach. And so people said to me, how could you have that kind of a program really and it not become really unpleasant? And the answer is, you can. It was not only were there no nasty comments made by anyone, audience or on the panel, but we do a survey after all of these. And one of the questions we always ask is, we want to know whether anyone changed their mind. We assume people will not change their mind, by the way. If they do, that's great, but I mean, that's not the point of what we're doing. We ask them if there's something they learned that they didn't know before they sat down. And in that particular one, 90% of people said yes. So what happens is that, you know, you can do this. And what the point of doing it is not just to entertain people so that they can come. The point is try and change the tone of these conversations in this community. And you know, I don't know how many of you read Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point. For those of you that have read it and understand what I'm about to say, I don't know what the tipping point is, but somewhere out there, I believe the American people are going to stand up and say, I've had enough. I'm not going to support people that believe the only way they can communicate with me is by trashing someone else. Now, unfortunately, I don't think we're necessarily that close. But when people ask me why I do this, I say, well, here's the real reason. My kids say, well, Dad, you're at an age now, you ought to be retired. You don't need to be running around doing all this stuff, which I agree with. But I said that here's the real point. I grew up at a time when people could disagree really vociferously with each other and then go out to dinner together. And they could sort of, in other words, they could depersonalize the fact that they looked at the world differently. Now, my kids and my grandkids, they don't know this world. They think what they see on television right now is the way it is. And somewhere along the line, I think what we have to do is we have an affirmative responsibility. Those of us that know it can be better, it can be different, to not act like it's okay what's going on right now. Because you know what? It's not okay. It's really, it's degrading what is, I believe, the great American experiment. Because, and this is the final point I want to make, and then I'll open up the questions. There's a lot of talk from time to time about American exceptionalism. And it is a cause that is alternately embraced by the left or the right, depending upon who's in power and depending upon what's going on at that point in time. I believe in American exceptionalism, but this is what I believe that it is. What is exceptional about America is that we have a pluralistic society, and we have the longest continuous democracy in the world. Now, that's a big deal. When you look at countries that developed democracies in the beginning of the 20th century or after World War II, number one, they're not very pluralistic. They're not very diverse. And when they've had to deal with diversity through immigration and other things, they don't do it very well. We have learned how to do that. And I think what becomes critical is that we don't forget that message. For those of us, there may be a few people here whose ancestors came over on the Mayflower, but I'm guessing that for the most of us, at some point or another in our lives, or in our ancestors' lives, they got here in a different way. And they helped make this country as great as it is. And so I think we have an incumbent responsibility to them, to the people who, as I always like to point out, on whose shoulders we stand in terms of the opportunities that we've gotten. And my hope is that everyone here not only continues to do the fine work you're doing with the League, but that you will come to an American Public Square event. And while I have the microphone, I will tell you the next one, so you can't forget. On the 1st of March, Deval Patrick, who some of you may know who he is. He was the former governor of Massachusetts. Will be at the Community of Christ Church in Independence, Missouri. And on the 13th of March, at the Unity Temple on the Plaza, we will have a program on fake news. And we will have the, I'm sorry, I'm kidding. And on February 15th, we will have what's the name of the program?
It's to do with religion and politics.
Okay, we have a faith program on the 15th of February at Village Presbyterian Church, and which is a run-up to the 7 Days program, which some of you may or may not be aware of. And on the 13th, on our Faith News program, we will have Margaret Talib, who is the head of the White House Correspondents Association and a Bloomberg White House correspondent. Colleen Nelson, who was the Wall Street Journal White House correspondent, who is now the editorial page editor of the Kansas City Star. Kevin Madden, who is Mitt Romney's spokesperson for the 2012 campaign, and a fourth person that we're still in the process of trying to snare. I will tell you that the other thing about American Public Square that's different than a lot of other organizations, we don't pay any of our speakers to come. We give them, what we promise them is great Kansas City hospitality. We give them a plane ticket. We give them a place to sleep. We offer them barbecue if they want it. And what happens is that more and more people have been willing to come because they've talked to people about some of the things that we've done. And what we have, we believe, is unique. We think that it is something that will continue to grow in this community, and would invite all of you to come sample our wares. Both of the programs are free, but we of course would prefer you to become a member. But nonetheless, we would love to see you all there. So with that, I will stop and be happy to entertain questions.
Greetings from a red blanket baby from Brentwood, Missouri, your neighbor growing up. Talk to me a bit about two topics. One is the threat to democracy of gerrymandering and what you think is going to happen on the Supreme Court. And secondly, about voter suppression.
Okay, first of all, gerrymandering, and this is something we should all keep in mind, okay? This is not new, okay? I mean, this has been going on for 150 years. I mean, this is sort of like, they call this politics, okay? Now, I'm not saying that it's a good thing. I'm just saying that it's just a fact, okay? Now, in Florida, they passed a constitutional amendment to create a, quote, bipartisan or nonpartisan board, which the legislature, of course, immediately tried to ignore, and ultimately, after 2 or 3 trips to the Supreme Court, they're redrawing the lines. I have no idea what the court will do. I think the real question is, when you win elections in this country, there are consequences. There are those of us who were elated when Barack Obama was elected president, and there are those other people who were depressed when he was elected. The same thing that was true with George Bush, the same thing is true with Donald Trump. It's part of the process. And what we don't get to do is because we don't like the outcome, we don't get to make it an illegitimate outcome. I think that gerrymandering is something that, I think the biggest problem is this. It used to be there were a handful of people that sort of kind of knew where the lines needed to go to enhance their ability on districts. But with computers, now, they really brought it to such a point that I think some intervention by the court to sort of maybe normalize things a little would probably be a good thing. I'm just sort of saying that, we shouldn't act like, oh my God, we've just discovered this terrible thing. Voter suppression is, to me, one of the most vile things that people can do. Because, the idea really is that, first of all, if you just as a human being look at what price people pay throughout the world to have an opportunity to vote. I mean, not just in this country, but everywhere. How could you in any way think that you would want to be part of something that would intimidate people from voting? Now, there are people who believe that there has been voter fraud in this country. And let me tell you, living in Kansas City, when Pendergast was running this town, they used to have a turnout of 110% of registered voters. The old saying was, just because you died doesn't mean you've given up your right to vote. And so, in other words, it's not like there isn't a history that people, in other words, if I believe that voter fraud should be going on, whether it's Mayor Daley in Chicago, or whether it was what was going on in Texas when Lyndon Johnson was elected to the Senate in 1948. There are lots of examples. So it's not like, there is no history here. I do think current excuses, I think that what's happened, though, is we're way past a lot of that stuff. I think it's being used as an excuse, and I think it's shameful. Hello?
I need to know, please tell me, what do you do when you're in conversation with someone or people and they start exercising their without even knowing what my political views are, and we're in disagreement? How do you handle that?
You're breaking up a little. I think is the question.
Yeah. Okay. When you're in conversation with someone.
Hello. The microphone goes out. Yeah. 1, 2, 3. Okay.
When you're in conversation with someone.
I think he's saying when you're discussing with someone, how do you handle the conversation? They don't know his political views, but they go ahead and...
Okay, so if I understand... Okay, it's no.
My wife says to shut up.
Well, no, first of all, the question, as I understand it, basically is somebody comes and says, well, they don't know what your point of view is, and you go up to them and say, let me tell you about that ridiculous person, whoever that person is. Let me tell you, they ought to be in jail, and there's this and there's that and the other. And they have no. And what are you supposed to do? Well, actually, that does happen to me from time to time. And so, what I'm just generally trying to do is I say, well, I understand what you're telling me, but let me see whether if we look at it somewhat differently, you might come to a different conclusion. Maybe not. And I try very hard to begin to move them towards something that is sort of a fallacy of where they're beginning. In other words, these people who do things like that, and by the way, I have a lot of friends who, I mention the word Donald Trump and they become apoplectic. and they may not know someone who maybe likes someone, and they will not hold back at all. So this is not something that is unique to one side or the other, okay? And I sort of say to them, I say, calm down. Yeah, I mean, could I be as outraged as you are about this, that, or the other? Sure. Do I think you would be constructive? It might be good for my blood pressure, but aside from that, nothing else. So I think really what happens is this. I think it becomes something that, I've become much better at as I've gotten older. I used to be totally incapable of that. But let me point something out to you, and this is something I think that we forget a lot of the time. Has anyone here ever heard of a book called The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt? Okay, for those of you who haven't read it, I highly recommend it. But people are always recommending books, so most of you probably won't. But the point that he makes, he's a social psychologist, and his point really is that we react the way we do politically as well as religiously. It is very rarely a rational process that got us to where we got. It's usually an emotional and an intuitive process, and then what our rational mind does is it justifies where we are. And he uses as examples of elephants and riders. And he says the elephants, which is our emotions and our intuition, and so the way we were raised, the elephants lean to the left or they lean to the right, depending upon what the issue is. And what the rider, which is our rational mind, does, they justify which way I'm leaning. The elephant's leaning. And we spend all our time yelling at the rider as if somehow that's going to change the way the elephant's leaning. And what his point is that unless you spend time around people who look at the world differently than you do, and their basis is the same as yours in terms of it's an emotional and intuitive reaction, the fact of the matter is, it's very difficult to even communicate with people, much less get people to sort of look at things differently. Because most people haven't gone through this including all of us, by the way. It's not just those people, all of us. We haven't gone through a rational process completely to get to our position. I told you who my parents voted for in 1948. They voted for Henry Wallace on the Progressive Party ticket. The fact that I grew up to be a liberal Democrat doesn't come as a huge surprise, and it probably wasn't a rational process that got me there. It was the way I was raised. It was the way I grew up to look at things and to measure things. And I think that's true of all of us. So that's the problem, and we have to be willing to sort of say, okay. And of course, the other thing that I always point to is the wonderful quote from Daniel Patrick Moynihan, where he was evidently in a debate on the floor of the Senate, and someone said to him, well, that's your opinion, I have my opinion, and Moynihan said, well, yes, you're certainly entitled to your opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And I think that what happens is that we've come to confuse our own opinion with facts.
Hi, my question is pretty much logistical. So American Public Square, is it through the whole country? Are there chapters everywhere? And the reason why I ask is, of course, my family, like many, we have extremists on the right and extremists on the left, including my children who live in different cities, and we all get online and there's big arguments and stuff. And so it's like, oh, can, my daughter in one city and my son in another city, and, different aunt and uncle in a different city, can we all be at these types of things all across the country?
Okay, well, first of all, American Public Square currently exists only in Kansas City, although we have an affiliate in, of all places, Berks County, Pennsylvania. We still have we know the Village Square, which was in Tallahassee, and they have one in St. Petersburg and in Salt Lake City. What's happened, people have talked to us about whether or not we were going to go other places. And by the way, when I say Kansas City, we have programs throughout the metropolitan area. We've had them out at the Church of the Resurrection. We've had them at Donnelly College. We've had them, of course, at UMKC, at Truman Library, Village Presbyterian, Community of Christ. I know I'm forgetting 2 or 3 others. But nonetheless, so we move throughout the community. But the reality is that there are other organizations throughout the country. There are a lot of organizations around the country that are really trying to get people to look at things a little differently. There's a group called All Sides, which you can get to online, run by a Republican, a guy named John Gable out of California. And whenever there's an issue, what he publishes is, okay, this is what's coming from the left, this is what's coming from the right, this is what's coming from the center. And the idea of really trying to get people to sort of realize that, okay, and he generally doesn't publish crazy things from one side or the other, And so I think that what happens here is that we have to recognize that there are different ways of looking at things.
Other questions?
My question just follows up on your last point. That is, where do you get your facts? Now, there's a big issue between the Democrats and the Republicans, and I think it's honestly true that the Democrats are more science-based, which is based on reason and peer-reviewed literature and the like. So how do you deal with someone who's not accepting science?
First of all, let me guess that you're a Democrat. No, I'm sorry. It's a good question, and here's the problem, okay? The problem is that we have we've reached a point where we feel that if we agree with you on this fact, that we somehow have conceded the political points. And so therefore what we do is we sort of back away from anything, that even though, we kind of know it's probably true, but we think there must be more to the story. I think that what's happened is, I tend to agree that if you take the science piece, certainly if you look at something like climate change, which would seem to me to be kind of a pretty, there's not a whole lot of disagreement about it. There's a huge body of disagreement, and I think could be a very constructive conversation as to what you do about it, okay? I remember 10 years ago, and I was convinced this was the right thing, and I probably was wrong, was that this whole cap and trade was going, I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, I don't bore you with the details, but it was a way of somehow we were going to sort of reduce the amount of CO2 that was going to be going into the atmosphere, and the cap and trade, that was the answer, boy. And you know what? So in Europe they did it, and guess what? It's been worthless in Europe. There are other things they're doing in Europe, but that one hasn't worked out so well. So all I'm saying is that the problem is if we can get past the basic facts, then we can have what I think are the intelligent conversations, which is, okay, what's the best way to go about this?
Doug, I'd like to ask you, give you some information about our league on the gerrymandering issue. We used to have, before a lot of these people were members, several members of our chapter who would get on the committee to draw the district line, and they would do it right. And I don't think anybody can dispute my facts on that. And I want to lay a bouquet on our league and give you that information.
Yeah, okay, that's great. Let me just sort of make one comment about gerrymandering, because I think this is something that most people may not be aware of. And again, it sort of goes how these things are never quite as, I'm fond of saying that my favorite Lyndon Johnson quote was that for every complicated problem, there's always a simple answer, and it's always wrong. And so, for gerrymandering, what happened in the early 90s was the Republicans got very smart politically. They went to the African American community that was historically underrepresented in state legislatures and in Congress, and they said, we're going to work with you and create more districts that people of color can be elected to. And they did. And it was very successful. But what they did in the process was they took it because of the overwhelming democratic nature, and that's with a big D, of people of color in their voting patterns. They took a lot of Democrats out of marginal districts and they moved them into districts, so they created districts for people of color. The result of that was created more Republican access districts. So you can sort of pick your poison. I think it was very important that we increase the number of minority representatives who were elected. And that's why every time you look at something like this, it's very important that they understand the history and recognize what the impact is when you decide, oh, we're going to do things totally objectively, because the point is, nothing in politics is ever totally objective.
I have two sort of related questions. One is, what's the difference between the goals of your organization and simply telling us, oh, we should be moderates, maybe slightly left or slightly right? And then how do more extreme, maybe not far right or far left, but how do those two groups come to compromise?
Okay, well, first, let me answer your first question. First of all, we're not problem solvers. we don't think it's our job to come up with the answer. What we think it is, it's our job to be able to stimulate constructive conversation between people who don't agree with each other. That doesn't mean that we're not sort of saying you should become more moderate, that liberals should become less liberal, conservatives should become less conservative. We are saying the rhetoric that's used and the basis upon the conversation and the contact with people who are not like you needs to be significantly improved. And the second question, I'm sorry, was...
How do two opposing groups come to compromise?
Well, I think what happens is this. I think that, first of all, it's not like it never happened in this country, okay? I mean, if you want to start somewhere, look at the Constitution, okay? The Constitution of the United States is the ultimate compromise. Why do you think we have a bicameral legislature? Why do you think there's a House of Representatives and a Senate? Because the big states, basically wanted a House of Representatives because it was based on population. They thought that should be the way it should be, and it's most, by the way, it's most parliaments in Europe are. And the small states said, wait a minute, we don't want to be, underrepresented. So what happened? It was the ultimate compromise. And then and all their compromises, which by the way are not so honored today, was the compromise on slavery. Okay, essentially put in the Constitution, slaves were made less than human, 3/5, and it was a compromise with the southern states. Now, there are all kinds of compromises that are made, some of which are very good and some of which are not so good. But the concept of recognizing that everything cannot be a zero-sum game. It can't just be if it's good for me, it's bad for you. And if it's good for you, I automatically have to oppose it because I assume it's bad for me. What it really has to be, it has to be one of those things where you sort of say, okay, we're trying to get money for this bridge. And I think if we put a toll on the old bridge to pay for it, that's the best way to do it. We go, no, I don't want to do that because it's going to slow down traffic. So what we need to do is we need to take some of the money from this fund and we need to put it over there. Well, so what you wind up doing is you sort of say, okay, we'll try it your way. Because what I really want is the bridge built. And I also don't think your way is the best way, but I'm more interested in getting the bridge built than I'm fighting for the next 2 years about which form of revenue we're going to use to pay for it. We don't get very much of that anymore. We used to get a whole lot of it. When I worked many years ago, I worked on Capitol Hill for a Democratic representative when the Democrats ran the House. And what they would do on any major bill, because there were a lot of Southern conservatives, if there was something that the Southern conservatives would not accept, they would go sit down with Bob Michael, who was the minority leader from Illinois, and they would say, okay, Bob, what do you need in this bill? And because we need 40 Republican votes. And he would go back to his caucus, and they would talk about this then, and they would come and they'd bring in this, and then Tip O'Neill would say, no, that's too much, we'll give you this, and they would go back and forth, and then ultimately, you know what happened? They all got together and they passed it. And nobody pointed fingers at each other that they were selling anybody out. It was the way the process worked. And the reason it doesn't work that way anymore, well, there are many reasons. But the fact of the matter is that right now the political price of compromise has become very high. And let me just point one other thing out too. And this is, people have said to me, I'm trying to explain to people why, well, never mind, I'll get to that later.
Jody's going to take one last question, and then we're... I see we have a lot of questions.
They've had their hand up the whole
So I was...
We'll take a couple more then.
I was hoping you could give us your advice on how to deal with close family members, the kind that are too close to avoid, whose views are so extreme that their words tend to dehumanize the things that I believe, actually dehumanize the people who believe the same things that I believe.
Okay, one, of course, you can not get together with your family. No, I think this is what I try to do, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work. And that is to say to people, if someone who disagreed with you described you in those terms, even though I disagree with you, I would find it very upsetting. So you have to understand how it sounds to me when you're doing the same thing. I know you wouldn't like it, and because you remember my family, you know, and I know you're a good, we may disagree, but I know you're a good person. Even if you're not so sure. The point of it is that most people believe that they're good people. I mean, who do you know who runs around and sort of says, I'm a lousy person, I'm proud. Nobody does that. And the other thing is that most people think that the facts support their position. I mean, who runs around and sort of says, well, no, I know that this is totally factually inaccurate, but I believe it anyway. You know, very few people are like that. So what happens is it requires more patience than we're used to having, but the circumstances are such today, I think, in our country, that we need to invest that kind of time and effort.
We have such a plethora of questions.
So my question was, among millennials and Gen Z, a lot of us are online these days and on digital media, social media. You mentioned how back in the day people were able to have civil discourse because they were watching TV together or reading newspapers and they were able to discuss. But online these days, there are communities and forums where they can go to where they already agree with each other. And then if they see something they don't believe in, they just block it or delete it from their newsfeed. In social media, especially on Facebook, they're curated to be content people already agree with. So how do you encourage what you do? How do you encourage what you do, but on an online forum format?
Well, it's a great question, and here's really, first of all, I know how significant social media is. I don't understand it, but I know it's very important. And I know also that the internet is incredibly tribal, and there's a tendency, just what you said very well. You go to places that or people that you know that agree with you. You go to websites that reinforce what your views. This is all we all know. This is called bias reinforcement, and everything that we think we can go find people in a place to go that's going to reinforce it. We are trying to work with some people to try and create something online where people who disagree with each other can do it in a way that is not so unpleasant. Because much of the time people communicate online with people, either people they agree with on everything, or if they don't agree, it's just like horrible what they say. In other words, it's not someone saying, I think you missed the point here because really what we should be doing, there's very little of that. It's like, you're an idiot, why don't you leave the country, whatever it might happen to be. And it's a real problem, and I think that, in many ways, it's going to be up to the millennials and the Gen Xers to sort of, it's your world, okay? Much more so than most of us sitting around this room, okay? I mean, we may go on so that we can order something on Netflix, but the reality is, most of us really, at least unless you all are a lot different than I am, we're going to spend our time sort of, communicating with people that way. And it really is going to require people like yourself and others to sort of think it through and sort of say, okay, what would appeal to me? See, I know what would appeal to me, but I'm not the audience here, okay? What we need are younger people who are willing to say, and by the way, if, you have any interest in helping us on that, let us know today. We will put you to work. And really, because, and I'm not being facetious, the fact is, it's a huge problem. And I know it's a huge problem. I don't know what to do about it. And frankly, I don't think people my age generally know what to do about it. I think it has to be done by people who are younger, who look up and sort of say, okay, I want to change the conversation. And I want to change the tone of the conversation. No one's asking anyone to give up their beliefs. I think that's what's really important here. And sort of, no one's sort of trying to say, well, you're liberal and you're too liberal. You're conservative, you're too conservative. No one's saying that. All we're saying is that, people that don't agree with you oftentimes have good reasons for believing what they believe. Most of the time, it's because it's the way that they grew up and what their value system was and how they look at things. And remember one other thing too. Most of us, if you look at the definition sort of, of morality, what you're really talking about is a whole system of different things that people accept to restrict their behavior. But that the community buys as a group to restrict bad behavior. And there's probably we have a lot more in common with each other than we ever care to really sort of pay attention to, because the differences are so raw and they're out there. And let me just sort of, do we have time? We have questions? Is this it?
Go ahead, Nate.
Okay. I was going to make a comment about friends of mine who've been very upset with the president have come to me and said, why are these Republican legislators, why aren't they doing something? Why aren't they sort of, reacting to some of the things? And we're not talking about, forget policy for a second, we're just talking about tweets or personal insults that might be hurled, which is unusual when coming from a president of the United States. And I explained to them, I said, here's the practical reality, and you have to think about this. If you're a Republican office holder, and you live in a district that's perhaps 55, say it's 50% Republican, 40% Democratic, 10% Independent, which means it's a pretty safe Republican seat. The president's followers are extremely supportive of him regardless of the circumstances. We've seen that, okay? So if you're a Republican and you decide to get into a disagreement with the president, half of the people who vote for you in your district to elect you are suddenly alienated. Now, switch it to the Democratic side. If you had the same thing, I don't know whether the behavior would be particularly different, and I'm a Democrat. Okay? What I'm saying is, understand the political dynamic that's going on in the country right now. And we've never had a president who had a personal following the way this president does. That is much more to do with him than any of the policies or anything like that. It is him. And that changes the whole dynamic. And it's very easy, by the way, when none of us are putting our jobs or livelihoods on the line, to be very idealistic and self-righteous. I'm not excusing it, I'm trying to explain it. I ran into a friend of mine who was a Republican elected official, and he said to me that his daughters had come to him and said, how can you support the president given his policy on whatever, take your pick. And he says, so I hear this on one hand. He said, on the other hand, my political consultants say every day they're terrified that I'm going to become the subject of a Twitter storm. So that's the world and he said, if that happens, I can't get reelected. That's the world that these people live in. And so, I'm not trying to say, you need to understand it. And a little empathy goes a long way. So, first of all, this has been delightful. I've enjoyed this very much. I'm going to hang around for a little bit if anybody else wants to talk to me and ask any questions. And it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. One other thing. We have some materials on American Public Square. We'd love to pick up a few memberships today, those of you who would like to join. And if not, we certainly hope to see you at some of our events. Thank you.